Hello, welcome back. Today, I want us to finish up some things with the Industrial Revolution by looking at some movements that occurred during the time of the Industrial Revolution that impacted this whole period of time. Uh, these were movements that impacted the visual arts, literature, as well as music. And so there's three main ones that I'd like for you to know. And so let's talk about them and then wrap some things up with the Industrial Revolution. The first of these movements I'd like for you to know something about is Romanticism. Romanticism was largely a reaction against the Enlightenment of the classical period, where everything was so mathematically measured and precise. Romanticism is tending to look at things from a more of an emotional perspective and to kind of glorify the subject matter. So if you're looking at the past, you're going to make it look really glorious and wonderful. If you're looking at nature, you're going to make it spectacular and beautiful and bold and overwhelming with its majesty. So, um, you know, there are several people that are associated with this movement, but probably the one that you maybe know the most about is going to be Victor Hugo with this Hunchback of Notre Dame. Most of you are familiar with that story. There's a Disney uh, film that's based on it, and also the musical Les Miserables is based on a book by the same name. So, he's probably the most famous writer from this time period you know something about. And of course, Beethoven, most people have heard of him. He's actually an artist that is a bridge artist between the classical period and the romantic period. So his music reflects elements actually of both of those, but his Fifth Symphony is probably the most famous that you've actually heard. The second movement that I like for you to know something about is realism. Realism is largely a result of the Industrial Revolution because there were some issues and things that were happening that were less than nice. And so realism was a way of confronting those things. So realism represents subject matter truthfully without artificiality and avoids speculative fiction and supernatural elements. In other words, what you see is what's going to be shown to you. Probably Charles Dickens is the most famous writer from this time period, and Mark Twain, who actually portray in very realistic terms the society around them. You know, Dickens, for example, with Oliver Twist, really looks at the plight of orphans within an industrial society. So, is a way of bringing these things to people's attention. You have the development of photography in this middle of the 1800s that started. So you can't get more real than a photograph. So Louis Daguerre is the person that invented this process, and Matthew Brady is probably one of the most famous photographers from this time period that you may know something about. If you've ever seen a photograph of Lincoln, it's most likely a Matthew Brady photograph. Uh, the third movement that I'd like for you to know something about is Impressionism. Impressionism really has it goes away. It's not necessarily realistic, although you can identify the things that are in it, but it's really focusing more on light and how light hits things and motion that's shown within the paintings. And so very often, it's it's not so much a clear visual as it's more of a blur of color and movement that's going on. Uh, so they really emphasized on these different types of angles, things. Um, Monet is probably the most famous impressionist artist. His water lilies actually are a series of paintings where he takes water lilies in a pond and shows what these water lilies look like under changing light conditions. So we're going to look at some examples of those. You have a post-impressionist movement that is really kind of a reaction against these earlier movements. They don't want to be restricted to realism. And they want to experiment with some things with color and other perspectives. So in some ways, the post-impressionists are sort of the gateway into what we would call abstract art, okay, more modern art. And Van Gogh probably is the most famous of these artists. His Starry Night is one of the most well known paintings that represent the post-impressionist movement. So we're going to look at some examples of his work too. As far as the impact of the revolution, the Industrial Revolution is concerned, uh, Britain, the United States, Germany, France, Japan, Russia, those were all places that did industrialize, and they became very powerful economically and militarily. And so that's going to have some ramifications as we start to talk about global imperialism leading up to the First World War. Uh, you have a new way in which things are made in factories, new production methods that are tied to machinery. And so this is changing how people live their lives. You have more of a sense of time here where people have to clock in, work so many hours, and clock out, and they have to work to the pace of a machine. So it really changed how people looked at the seasons, how they looked at life. With the invention of electricity, obviously people could stay up later and do things, but it made people have to work more. So, that's not always, positive. There were advances that were made in other areas, like for instance, with transportation, you have locomotives, you have steam boats, you ultimately had airplanes that were invented, automobiles. And then with communications, you have the telegraph and then the wireless telegraph that was invented. Also, the telephone came about in the late 1800s. So things that we still value today, radios and telephones, we still use them and still appreciate them. You also start to see businesses becoming very large. You actually have some monopolies that become created because these businesses become so big they overwhelmed all their competitors, bought them up, drove them out of business. And so you created a whole new situation, a whole really set of problems over one company controlling everything, like say oil production or steel. So that caused some problems, and the growth of labor unions is kind of tied in with this because workers start to see that there's a value with joining together and pushing for common goals like better wages, better working conditions. With a more urban setting, you see some rapid changes taking place within the medicines and science. So that's going to be improving people's lives. And because you have these changes that are taking place, particularly with medical care and with sanitation, population is going to start to get bigger because fewer people are dying. You also see people start to attain a higher standard of living because of industrialization, because now there's more money, there's a more diverse economy, and people have a material standard of living that's much better. In fact, it continued to get better even really up till today. So industrialization enables us to have access to more resources and more things. You start to see the social structure as we understand it today begin to develop with the three social classes: the upper class, the middle class, and the working slash lower classes. And you particularly see the middle class start to expand because as businesses began to grow, there was a need for management, and so those managers, because they are making more money than their average worker, you start to see a much larger middle class begin to grow. So it wasn't just professional people like doctors and lawyers, but you have people that were at the management levels within these businesses. Uh, and you start to see urban workers beginning to get more of a sense of identity. Fewer people are working on the farms, but you have these people that are not necessarily skilled, but coming to cities for work. And you see some reform movements growing. We've already mentioned some things like the suffrage movement for women, the abolition of slavery, the temperance movement to abolish the use of alcohol, uh, movements to end child labor, movements to take care of mentally ill people. So those types of things start to pick up pace during the Industrial Revolution. And you particularly see public education expanded because now that they no longer wanted children to be working in factories, they expected children to be in school. And so this is where the compulsory education laws come in and are still enforced today. So you have to be in school till you're 16, and so if you're not, your family is guilty of truancy. So that's why it's very important for people to be in school. But they no longer wanted kids to work. They wanted kids to become educated, which is going to lead to better paying jobs, leads back up to that higher standard of living. So you see that it's all kind of circular there. So this concludes the notes for topic 7. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. You have access to these notes, this video, and to the pictures in your folder in Schoology. So as always, if you have any issues, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you for the next topic. Thank you.